November 16th, 1957. Plainfield, Wisconsin, a town so small that everyone knew everyone else. A place where doors were left unlocked, where neighbors borrowed sugar without asking, where nothing truly evil was supposed to exist. But that morning, something felt wrong. Bernice Warden, a 58-year-old hardware store owner, had not returned home the night before. Her son, Deputy Sheriff Frank Warden, walked into the store and immediately sensed it. The register was open, there was blood on the floor, and his mother was gone. There were no signs of a robbery, no witnesses, no forced entry, just a quiet store and a dark red stain stretching across the wooden boards. On the counter sat a sales slip from the previous day. One name was written on it, Ed Gein, a quiet, awkward bachelor who lived alone on a farm just outside town. No one panicked when his name came up. Ed wasn't threatening, he wasn't aggressive, he was strange, yes, socially off, nervous, prone to odd laughter, but not dangerous. At least, that's what they thought. That evening, officers drove down the dirt road leading to his property. The farmhouse sat isolated, surrounded by dead grass and skeletal trees. No lights were on. When they entered the shed beside the house, their flashlights caught something hanging in the darkness. At first, they couldn't process what they were seeing, but when the beam steadied, reality hit. It was Bernice Warden. What they would discover next inside that farmhouse would shock not just Plainfield, but the entire country. Because this wasn't just a murder scene, it was something far more disturbing. To understand what happened inside that house, we have to go back to 1906, back to a boy raised in isolation, back to a mother who shaped a monster without ever meaning to. A childhood under control Ed Gein was born Edward Theodore Gein in 1906, the second son of George and Augusta Gein. His father was an alcoholic, unstable, often violent, drifting from job to job. But George was not the dominant force in that home. Augusta was. Augusta Gein was deeply religious, but her beliefs weren't comforting or nurturing. They were severe, apocalyptic, extreme. She believed the world was rotten. She believed women were instruments of sin. She believed sexuality was corruption, and she raised her sons under those convictions. Ed and his older brother Henry were forbidden from forming friendships, forbidden from dating, forbidden from interacting socially unless absolutely necessary. Augusta preached to them daily, long lectures about morality, purity, and damnation. In 1914, the family moved to a remote farm outside Plainfield, further isolating themselves from society. That isolation became Ed's entire world. No social development, no emotional independence, no outside influence, just his mother. While Henry began to question Augusta's rigid worldview as he got older, Ed did the opposite. He worshipped her. He idolized her. In his mind, she was the only pure woman on earth, the first death. In 1940, Ed's father died of heart failure, weakened by years of alcoholism. It left Augusta, Henry, and Ed alone on the farm. But tension between the brothers began to grow. Henry had started openly criticizing their mother's influence. He believed she was too controlling, too harsh. Then, in 1944, while the brothers were burning brush on the property, a fire broke out. When authorities arrived, Henry was dead. Officially, it was ruled an accident. But there were strange details. Ed led investigators directly to Henry's body, despite the smoke and chaos. Some reports suggested Henry had bruises on his head. Nothing was proven, but Henry was gone, and Augusta's hold over Ed tightened even more. The death that broke him. In 1945, Augusta suffered a series of strokes. Ed nursed her obsessively. When she died later that year, something inside him collapsed. For most people, losing a parent is devastating. For Ed, it was catastrophic. He boarded up her bedroom, sealing it like a shrine. Everything remained untouched, dust-free, frozen in time. The rest of the farmhouse fell into decay. Rotting food, dirt-covered floors, darkened windows. It was as if only one part of the house had ever mattered, and now that she was gone, the world had no structure left. Neighbors still saw Ed around town. He did odd jobs, babysat occasionally, laughed nervously at inappropriate moments. People thought he was harmless, but inside that farmhouse, alone at night, something was developing, an obsession. The obsession begins. After Augusta's death, Ed began spending hours reading, not novels, not newspapers, books about anatomy, true crime, human experimentation, historical accounts of grave robbing, and extreme medical procedures. He became fascinated with the human body, but more specifically, he became fixated on women who resembled his mother, middle-aged, strong features, authority in their posture. He later admitted that sometimes he felt as though his mother was still speaking to him, commanding him, and eventually he began visiting local cemeteries at night. He targeted freshly buried women. Sometimes, he claimed, he would dig up a coffin, open it, and then lose his nerve, returning the body and covering his tracks. Other times, he didn't. He began bringing parts back to the farmhouse, and that's when the line between delusion and reality completely dissolved. He wasn't collecting trophies. He wasn't killing for pleasure. In his disturbed mind, he was trying to reconstruct something. He later told investigators he wanted to create what he called a woman suit. He wanted to step inside it, to become his mother, not emotionally, physically. The disappearance of Mary Hogan. In 1954, a tavern owner named Mary Hogan vanished. There were bloodstains in her establishment. No body was ever found. The town whispered about it, but no solid suspects emerged. Years later, Ed would confess to killing her, but at the time, life in Plainfield returned to normal until November 1957, until Bernice Worden disappeared, and when police stepped into that farmhouse, they realized Mary Hogan had never really left. Inside that farmhouse, time had stopped. The kitchen was cluttered with trash and dirty dishes. Newspapers were stacked in corners. Dust coated nearly every surface. But one room stood out. It was spotless. Ed's mother's bedroom, perfectly preserved, as if she might walk back in at any moment. The bed neatly made, the curtains drawn, everything untouched. It wasn't just a room, it was a shrine. The rest of the house, however, told a very different story. As officers moved through the dimly lit rooms, their flashlights revealed objects that didn't belong in any home. Furniture upholstered in something that wasn't fabric. Bowls made from human skulls. A belt constructed from preserved remains. Drawers filled with bones. At first, deputies thought they were misunderstanding what they were seeing, but the longer they searched, the clearer it became. This wasn't random. It wasn't chaotic. It was methodical. Items were cleaned, arranged, repurposed, and then they found more. Boxes containing body parts, masks fashioned from preserved skin, articles of clothing carefully sewn together. Later, Ed would explain what he was trying to do. He wasn't collecting souvenirs in the traditional sense. He was attempting transformation. He told investigators he wanted to create what he described as a woman suit, so he could crawl inside it and, in his mind, become his mother. Not metaphorically, physically. The horror wasn't just in what he had done. It was in why he believed he needed to do it. When officers brought Ed Gein in for questioning, they didn't encounter rage. They didn't encounter defiance. They encountered calm. He spoke softly, answered politely, almost childlike in his demeanor. He admitted to digging up graves in local cemeteries, targeting women who resembled his mother. He described how he would visit burial sites at night, exhume the bodies, and bring parts back to the farmhouse. He claimed that sometimes he would lose his nerve and return them. Other times, he didn't. He confessed to killing Mary Hogan years earlier, and he admitted to shooting Bernice Worden. He insisted Bernice's death had been accidental, that the gun discharged unexpectedly. Whether that was true or not, investigators couldn't ignore the larger reality. Ed Gein had been living in a house of human remains for years. The town of Plainfield was stunned. This wasn't a drifter passing through. This wasn't an unknown predator. This was someone they had known, someone who had babysat their children, someone who had stood in line at the grocery store. The trial, however, wouldn't come quickly. Psychiatrists evaluated Ed and diagnosed him with severe mental illness, schizophrenia, and chronic psychosis. Doctors believed he experienced delusions centered around his mother. They described him as detached from reality, unable to distinguish fantasy from fact. His initial confession was thrown out due to misconduct during interrogation, but he repeated his admissions later. In 1968, more than a decade after his arrest, Ed Gein was declared competent to stand trial. He was found guilty of first-degree murder, but in a separate finding, he was ruled not guilty by reason of insanity. Instead of prison, he was committed to a state mental institution, and there, something almost unbelievable happened. Ed Gein became a model patient, orderly, cooperative, quiet. The same man who had constructed grotesque objects in isolation now followed routine, took medication, and caused no disruption. He remained institutionalized for the rest of his life. In 1984, at the age of 77, Ed Gein died of respiratory failure. He was buried in Plainfield, the same small town he had once terrified. Over time, people chipped away at his tombstone, stealing fragments as morbid souvenirs. Eventually, it was removed entirely. Today, his grave remains unmarked, but his legacy does not. Though he is confirmed to have killed 2 women, the psychological impact of his crimes far exceeded his body count. His story would go on to inspire some of the most infamous characters in horror fiction, not because of numbers, but because of the unsettling truth at the center of it all. Ed Gein wasn't a criminal mastermind. He wasn't charismatic. He wasn't outwardly monstrous. He was quiet, unassuming, and deeply, profoundly disturbed. A man shaped by isolation, by religious extremism, by untreated mental illness, by obsession with a mother he could not let go. The farmhouse is long gone. The rooms have been cleared, the objects destroyed. But the question lingers, how does someone become this? And how many warning signs were missed along the way? Because sometimes the most disturbing cases aren't about brutality alone. They're about what happens when isolation, control, and delusion are left to grow unchecked. And sometimes, the most terrifying monsters look exactly like the quiet man next door. Final chapter. The silence. After the farmhouse no longer stands. Not long after the investigation, it burned to the ground under mysterious circumstances. Some say it was arson. Some say it was mercy. Either way, the physical structure that housed the horror was reduced to ash. But destruction doesn't erase memory. The fields around Plainfield still stretch wide and quiet. The dirt road still exists. And somewhere beneath that soil lies the story of a man who couldn't let go of his mother and lost his grip on reality entirely. Ed Gein died in 1984 inside a mental institution. Not in a prison cell, not in isolation, but under supervision. Quiet, compliant, reportedly well-behaved. There's something unsettling about that. The idea that the man whose crimes shocked the nation spent decades living in routine, eating meals, speaking calmly with staff, as if two different versions of him existed. The disturbed grave robber and the soft-spoken patient. His tombstone, once placed in Plainfield Cemetery, was chipped away piece by piece by those fascinated with his infamy. Eventually, it was stolen. Today, his grave is unmarked. No monument, no inscription, no reminder for those who pass by. But the world remembers, because Ed Gein didn't just commit crimes. He changed culture. His story became the blueprint for some of the most infamous fictional killers ever created. The quiet house, the preserved room, the twisted devotion, the mask. But here's what makes this case different. Ed Gein wasn't driven by greed, or thrill, or even traditional rage. He was driven by delusion, by obsession, by a fractured mind shaped in isolation. And that makes it harder to process, because monsters that are calculated are easier to understand. Monsters created slowly, inside ordinary homes, behind closed doors, those are harder to see coming. Plainfield went back to being quiet. The stores reopened. The roads stayed calm. The town healed. But every small town has a story it wishes it didn't. For Plainfield, it will always be the farmhouse at the end of that dirt road. A case too disturbing to mention, and a reminder that sometimes evil doesn't arrive from the outside. Sometimes it grows quietly, in the dark.